I see we have already quite a lot of people who's joined us. Hi, my name is Rashad. Um, I'm from Terco Health Hub, responsible for partnerships and events and hosting this event from my home. But Terco is of course open for its startups. Um, So for those who don't know, Tarko is a startup hub focusing on health and life sciences in Finland, Helsinki, and we've been around for about 3.5 years and with about 50 startups in the community. Um, yeah, we have a bunch of events, programs. We have an accelerator, incubator, by the way, which has opened its application period just recently for the startups. So the second batch. And an accelerator happens to take place once a year, usually in the fall. And then we organize quite a lot of events, health talks, one of which is taking place today. And we have a bunch of corporate partners that we work with and help our community to flourish. And Irdeto is one of those partners as well. So today we will be discussing cybersecurity topic with our dear guests Shriekanth and Saif, and then and they will clarify this fairly obscure topic for all of us, what it is and why we should even care about it. So I believe we have slides from, I think, was it Shriekanth that wanted to first go through them? Yeah. So let's do it so that for the audience, please keep your mics muted, and we'll have the presentation going, and then we'll have some questions and answers. First, I'll ask our speakers the few basic fundamental questions, but then our audience, please feel free to ask as well in the chat. We will address them too, and we will also have a panel discussion where you guys can turn on your mics as well and ask the speakers directly. So, Shriekanth, please, off you go. You're on mute, as usual. That's the Zoom problem.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Rashad, for the kind introduction. And appreciate the opportunity to present and also share knowledge. Since we have Dr. Saif here also, I'll start to give off my introduction and just give a little bit of overview of what we do at Irdeto. So that
sorry, I completely forgot to introduce you guys properly, but we've discussed that you would say a few words about yourselves. So
right.
if you could say a few words about yourself first before jumping.
All right. Then I'll actually request Dr. Saif to go first so that
Okay.
you set the stage for the cybersecurity in connected health and the industry. Dr. Saif?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me, both of you. So my name is Dr. Saif Abed. I am a partner and director of cybersecurity services at the Abed Graham Group. I'm actually a medical doctor by background, and everyone in my team at the Abed Graham Group is a clinician of some sort, doctor or nurse, that has transitioned into working in the world of health IT and cybersecurity. So over the last decade, we've been advising government agencies, large healthcare providers, and large technology companies around the world when it comes to digital transformation, security, and risk. Beyond that, I also hold a number of accreditations and work as an independent expert on security and digital transformation in healthcare with the European Commission, on the roster of experts for the World Health Organization, and I'm accredited as a high-risk subject matter expert for the UK government's Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And yeah, I have a great relationship with Irdeto. We've worked with Irdeto for some time, and really enjoy having the stage to share some of our experiences and insights today. Over back to you, Shriekanth.
Perfect. So that gives you a gist of everything we want to cover today. So thank you, Dr. Saif. Uh, uh, to just give an introduction about Irdeto and to start off, to give an introduction about myself, I am Shriekanth Iyer. I'm part of the Irdeto's new connected health cybersecurity strategy incubation team. I'm also a biomedical engineer by training. I'm not a doctor as Dr. Saif, but I bring in over 13 years of public and private sector experience, both in commercial and regulatory functions in the medtech and digital health industry across Europe, Southeast Asia, and APAC markets. And for over half a decade, I was a regulator with the Singapore Ministry of Health, where I manage the team in medical devices, technical evaluation, and policy formulation with the industry as well in the medical devices industry. I'm a RAPS RAC certified regulatory professional, ISO 13485 internal auditor, ASQ Six Sigma Black Belt, and I've also been part of IMDRF regulatory committees. And until last couple of years ago, I led sales teams in GE Healthcare software and services business in Southeast Asia. And at Irdeto, we are looking at solving the connected health device and data security challenges through offering modular turnkey solutions. And I'll sort of start off with giving a brief introduction of just like 5-10 minutes before we deep dive into the discussion on the risk in cybersecurity. So Irdeto is actually a world leader in digital platform security across connected industries. And as you can see, it's video entertainment and gaming, which is our primary industries, but we are expanding into connected health, and that's the focus of this talk. And we've been around for quite a long time. In the digital world, it's if you see the analog plus digital world, we've been around for over 50 years. And at and in we are actually a software technology provider where so security provider where we protect over 7 billion applications for the some of the world's best known brands. And Irdeto is also inventor of white box cryptography, and we have hundreds of patents in security. And with offices in over 6 continents and deep pool of security experts, we are committed to be a partner of choice for security. Coming onto it, we have a lot of partners we work with, and we take a lot of pride working with the big companies as well as small companies. And these are some of our partners in security space. And you can see some of our partners. Yes, one of them is Turco Health as well. Moving forward in connected health, what we are trying to do is we want to improve people's life and to make sure that they trust the technologies they are using in the future of this connected healthcare ecosystem we are. And it's very important that patients and providers trust the software and applications. And we are deeply committed to make sure and securely enabling the connected future. And our mission in connected health is to secure patients and providers so they can embrace the connected world without fear. And what we offer, what our technology does in this spirit of enabling patient outcomes, we have developed a suite of turnkey solutions. And these are to streamline the integration, the security technologies to make sure that the customer is ready for connected health market. If you can see some of the technologies there in the screen are there, they are modular solutions and they can be easily applied by say startup or any of our partners to focus their development effort and the resources in building the best devices, remote health services, or a digital health software. While we make sure that the connected devices and software run in the secure in the environment they intended for, has a secure communication channel and updates, can detect and recover from cybersecurity attacks, and these devices are trusted regardless of where the device is located or which network it is located in. And we also make sure that the management of these devices is safe, updatable, and also to make sure that these devices comply with the current and the future cybersecurity regulations. And some of our high-level portfolio are, if you can see on the screen again, these are innovative and agile cybersecurity technologies This includes secure modules, this includes cybersecurity tools, services, so that the startups can build a proactive security posture into their devices and ensure defense by design. I would stop here. The last slide is actually just to say who are our partner profile, which are the startups. These includes connected medical devices. These include telehealth as well as digital health companies. So on the audience here, I assume a lot of these startups and people from the industry would fall into one of these buckets. So our technology as well as the discussion we're going to have would be quite relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that brief, comprehensive description of Irdeto and the subject. So I think you can stop sharing your screen probably. Yeah, and we can just focus on the discussion. So the first things first, I would like to come back to this very basic question of what is cybersecurity? I mean, probably most of us are familiar with it, but it's in a way a fancy term. And how is it? What is data security and what is cybersecurity, and how do these relate? And just the concept, introduction, basic one. Either of you.
Well, I mean, if I jump in, my answers are normally slightly controversial, one might even say, because it doesn't matter whether you call it data security or cybersecurity. It's the preservation of the function of a business. That's ultimately the goal. And I think one of the biggest challenges for security professionals, let alone professionals working in the technology space, is how do you get the boardroom in your organization, or how do you get the boardroom of your customers to understand that what you're doing when you're investing in your own security or advising about their security, why is it beneficial? Why is this investment going to be of benefit to the strategic direction of an organization? So it's very tempting to get into a technical discussion: privacy versus security, data security, information architecture, device life cycles. Incredibly important stuff, but sometimes it means you end up losing the language that you need to convince the people who are going to do anything with all this investment you're making, or may even be the people funding what you need to get your security to the right level. So I think I want to start with that, because I think language is a critical part of this for everyone, whether you're a startup or a very large organization.
Right. So you're basically saying that it's more about the priority, and you should be able to pitch why it is important to your board and your funders, basically your investors, this subject. And how do you pitch it to them very clearly? I mean, that why we should care about cybersecurity or our data security.
Well, before I hand over to Shriekanth, because
I
jumped straight in, I would say, at least for me, in healthcare, always starts with patient safety, and it starts with clinical risk quantification. That's the reason my organization exists. So if you can say, look, with our technology, these are all the benefits, but if we don't invest in security, admittedly, this is how things could go wrong, because this is what the attackers are trying to do. It could disrupt clinical care. It could disrupt accuracy of data. Very visceral, real world impact. That's always the best position to start with, and then work back to a more technical set of responses. Shriekanth, what do you think?
Well, I agree with the overall framework, but what happens is when people or organizations they only look at their myopic view, where they look at their immediate challenges. So I agree with Dr. Saif as well, as cybersecurity is a very, very broad term, right? It includes IT security, it includes OT security, all the program management which happens in organizations. And for a layman, we look at cybersecurity, we look at antivirus, password management. These are the things which comes to our mind. But when it comes to healthcare, we are actually talking about the broader security of the device, of the networks, and most importantly, the centerpiece here is patient. Because at the end of the day, patient, unfortunately, in the healthcare world, is the customer. So we are enabling patient outcomes in healthcare largely. And then cybersecurity is a value add, which sort of enables that the patient's care gets delivered with the use of connected technology, which we use, which is connected medical devices, with all the medical equipments, any device which we use, which touches the patient's body, which is a diagnostic, therapeutic, which is a monitoring tool, as long as it is connected, and everywhere we are connected now socially, physically we are not connected, we are using virtual Zoom nowadays, but everything is connected, and with networks and data, and so the privacy and all that comes into the picture. But do not forget the scope, that patient outcomes, and to make sure that in this connected world, patient gets care, patient gets treatment, patient gets diagnosis. All that, cybersecurity is an enabler, so it helps you to be calm and forget about any sort of attack or harm being done.
Yeah, and I assume this is also involved, is a integral part of getting a CE certification as well. There has to be certain criteria, or am I wrong about this?
Well, I can jump into it. I can sort of demystify a little bit. All right. So being a regulator, so I used to be a regulator with the Ministry of Health in Singapore. So you have two aspects. At the end of the day, you're looking at safety, which is the most important thing. Is it safe? Is it secure? Secure comes later, but safety, efficacy, okay, these are the two most important thing which comes when it comes to regulations. Now more and more, security is becoming a big key requirement. All right. Security was not so much earlier, but with connectivity and all network connectivity, device connectivity, data connectivity, security is becoming more and more important. And there is a complete security risk management which is now required, apart from the safety risk management when it comes to medical devices and software as medical device.
Could you explain what's the difference between safety and security?
I want to jump in on that using an analogy, because at the end of the, even though I actually have a degree in cybersecurity, I always speak as if I'm as a clinician, and I try to keep it in that way. So I like to use medical analogies. So let's take something very prominent right now. Let's look at vaccines. Everyone is looking at all the latest statistics about vaccine safety, vaccine efficacy. That's, you want to know if it's safe to get the vaccine. But what people don't look at so much is the security of the supply chain. Okay, so the vaccines may be safe, they may be highly effective, but if someone takes down the logistics company that's transporting or coordinating the delivery of the vaccines, the entire process becomes useless for as long as that system is offline. And that's the kind of difference that you see between safety and security. Many of your startups here may have done rigorous testing from a safety perspective of their devices to be used for care of patients. But a security event that disrupts the technical functionality causes it not to work properly and makes it unsafe despite the separate safety testing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As a regulator, I can imagine you're thinking my analogy is maybe a bit odd, but that's the way I look at it.
So one is more about the product, so to speak, and other one's about the processes, if I am to roughly
well, it's kind of your product itself could undergo rigorous testing and be safe, and you could be very confident of its safety profile. But you may be hosting your solution using a whole range of third-party support solutions. One of those breaks and it's embedded in your solution, and suddenly it's a security incident that actually has a safety ramification. So they're not separable, but they are often discussed as if they are, because the way you cause a problem is different in both instances.
Right. So I think we've established that it's fairly important for startups to care about their safety and security of their products. And then I guess the next natural question would be at which stage they should care about it.
All right, so I'll jump into this to understand the context here, right? For a startup, let it be a medical device company, let it be a digital health, or it can be a software as a medical device. Everything is sort of used interchangeably nowadays, right? So med tech is basically medical devices, healthcare IT, any healthcare software, which sort of falls under the definition of medical device, which is anything which is preventive, curing, therapeutic, and so the regulation, all that. So now I won't jump into the safety aspect of the device because it's everybody knows about it. I'll talk about the security aspect and especially the life cycle. So when you look at a device, a startup here, they are the manufacturer, right? So they have their own manufacturer life cycle, development life cycle. And then you have the customer, who is the hospital, which is a healthcare delivery organization. They have their own life cycle. Then you have, as your company, you have your maintenance life cycle, your update, patching, and all that. And like Dr. Saif said, you have also the supply chain life cycle. So these are all processes which are not static, but these are all revolving processes. So you can imagine like 4 circles, and each of these are always interdependent on each other. So this we call security life cycle management. And if I'm talking about my ecosystem and I'm assuming I'm a manufacturer, then I need to start thinking about this in a life cycle way, where I start from the conceptual and planning stage. What medical device is it? What problem is it solving? What is the value add from the existing competitor products in the market? What is my IP? You start the requirement planning and you start thinking about security at the design stage. So it's basically like if you follow the news, there are companies right now which are creating hardware which is future proof, so that not I wouldn't say future proof, but for a longer time, so that the software upgrades can give you functionality benefits. Because software, like now you have Apple Watch, you have the SPO2 coming up, say in 6 months. So SPO2 inside the sensor is a software development which adds on to the existing hardware of Apple inside that Apple Watch, not a medical device. So I wouldn't it's still a 510(k) approved, but you can talk about the ECG or other stuff where you add on functionality. So think about it from the starting stage, which is design stage. Try to embed your security from that aspect.
So from the beginning of the product development, basically. Yeah. Dr. Saif.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what I would just add is, I'd like to use a word that Shriekanth used, don't be myopic. When you start designing your product, think about where you are in the supply chain. Because for example, you have your device, your immediate, who you sell to commercially might not actually be a healthcare organization or a patient as a consumer. You might actually end up commercially contracting with a company that's going to be a distributor, or a company that runs a telehealth ecosystem with its own solutions that you become a part of. And then they're contracting with a healthcare organization that's then being subcontracted over time to get a larger and larger patient population in the community. But a failure at your end can have ramifications throughout the supply chain. And obviously that's bad for your reputation, it's bad for your business, it's bad for your investors, but ultimately it's bad for patient care, depending on the type of role your device is being used for. So I always advise at that design stage to undergo a type of risk assessment that's contextual and ecosystem oriented. And doing that at the design stage means you're building something that's a lot more robust and resilient for its entire journey.
And this might be a sort of a silly question, but would you be able to prioritize among all these things that startups have to do, the fundraising, sales, and internationalization, market research, and then the cybersecurity? And would you be able to put?
The simple answer is no, because as a startup, all these things are important to you. You need the money, you need to sell, you need partners, exactly, you need to market. You know, that's the kind of the blessing of the CEO of a startup. You become trained in doing all these skills in a way, but your curse is you have to do all these things at the same time. But true. The one thing I will say is, whereas security was something that wasn't really thought about before, you don't have the luxury of not thinking about security anymore. It's one of those must-do things now.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Saif. Security is not an afterthought. It is an enabler and it's a must. It's regulatory driven as well, but you have to. make sure you take care of it. If you're not able to find resources, right, find the right partner who understands the security challenges, the regulatory environment, or the markets you plan to work in. Start with assessing the risk, get into the technical so that they can provide technical resources to solve your actual problem, and also try and make sure that the commercial relationship you structure with the partner doesn't eat up your runway of scaling up your business. So that is also a mindset you should start thinking about.
Right. And then especially given this might be a side topic, but then especially with these GDPR issues, even with those, we have to think about the data safety or being aware of how we handle the data. This might be sort of related to that, but
I mean, Shriekanth is the regulatory guru here, but I just want to add, GDPR is one thing. Then there's the EU medical device regulations.
Right,
Then
yeah.
there's the NIS directive as well. If you are, a medical device that's going to function in an integrated care network or specifically in a hospital network, there are a lot of regulations. And I dare say, I imagine a lot of the startups here want to succeed globally. At that point, you have to think about the evolving advisory guidance for the FDA. You have to think about HIPAA. There's a lot of regulatory guidance that's evolving, and depending on the type of level of success you want to have, you have to really consider those. And especially because a lot of the regulatory agencies that I've dealt with, they're comparing notes over time. They don't necessarily copy each other, but they're looking over each other's shoulders saying, okay, what are you doing? Oh, that's a good idea. Maybe we should start looking at that. So there is some harmonization occurring as well.
Right. So then the next question, I guess, would be, what is it that the most challenging issues or biggest vulnerabilities in medical device field?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I mean, there isn't an answer of what's the biggest vulnerability. Unfortunately, it's just not that straightforward. But as a general rule of thumb, the absolute basics, when you go to, I don't know, let's call it cybersecurity school, they teach you about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And in recent years, cyber attacks that exploit vulnerabilities that lead to data confidentiality issues tended to grab the headlines. But then ransomware started becoming the big thing, disrupting patient care directly, causing harm, causing commercial damage, operational damage at scale. And so availability became the real issue. Over time, I think data integrity is going to become an issue. So exploiting a vulnerability, so you change the functionality of devices, scrambling the numbers, there's a lot of things. But today, I personally, purely from a clinical perspective, any vulnerability that can be exploited that renders your device unavailable, especially if you're a truly clinical medical device, irrespective of whether you're in the patient home or in the hospital setting, that tends to be what concerns me the most, because availability can cause harm and kill, whereas confidentiality, in most cases, is more of an ethical breach, as far as I see it.
Interesting perspective.
If I were to add to that, which is vulnerability, more than vulnerability is the exploitability, which is more important. There is this index known as VEX, which conveys this exposure or exploitability, particularly in downstream components. So not every vulnerability can be exploited or exposed. So there is a degree in that. But just to give the audience in this medtech sort of world, there are many vulnerabilities, design vulnerabilities, anything and everything. But there are like 3 or 4 which a manufacturer or a software as a medical device company should make sure they look at. First thing is actually remote firmware update. So it adds to a lot of issues. So look at that. Sometimes there are manufacturing support which is left unattended. So this is pretty important. Connectivity wise, if you have Bluetooth, low energy, BLE, or no authentication, these can lead to vulnerability. You can also have reverse engineering of your IP can be exploited, and physical attacks like physical channel, side channel left unattended. These are simple ones which at the end of the day, a startup should start looking at. So risk management is one, but this is something they should start looking at. like Dr. Saif said, there are many vulnerabilities. You can't even, it's a risk management process, right? You grade them, do your FMEA process, and identify the risk, do a CII triad for security. But at the end of the day, security and safety are two sides of the same coin. So you need to also make sure that safety is not compromised. You're very secure, but you're not safe. Not a good thing. You need to balance it and make sure it's safe and secure.
Shriekanth, what about hard-coded credentials as well?
Which is there's a strict no, like password like embedded in the code. So try and use like with connectivity. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this was still fine. So I used to be a service engineer, a clinical biomedical engineer in a hospital where you have the patches you need to update. You go get the key, go to the equipment, connect it through a USB at that time, or it was just network is not there, USB, and it's all hard coded. Like your username and password is hard coded, and it's actually you're surprising that Dr. Saif talk about the Ripple attack. It's huge, and this was NHS got crippled, so it's very true.
Right, I see. Well, quite scary. But what can you do? You have to, tackle all.
But just, Rashad, the point of it isn't to be scary.
Right.
The point of it is to understand is that this is the state of the world, and you are in a position as a startup to do something about it for yourself now.
Right.
You're not a company that's been around for 50 years that has bureaucratic processes and tens and 20,000, 30,000 employees, and everything has to be vetted one minute. You can be agile now and respond to this in a way that it becomes a competitive differentiator for you. Working with the right partners, the right experts, or in-house. There are a lot of options for you at the stage you are at when you're a startup.
It was actually going to be one of the questions I had, the way to do it. Do you always, it's a fancy topic, it's a difficult matter, just like regulations. CE marking, MDR, you always need an expert, well, pretty much always, to consult you on this. But how can you tackle cybersecurity yourself just by Googling, reading, or something?
I mean, you can. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You have to start somewhere. And also,
but how's it realistic? How realistic is it?
This is the point I want to make is that, look, and I say this running a firm that before we also got into product, we've been an advisor firm for 10 years. I've always, it's good to teach yourself to an extent. So at least you could figure out, are your consultants telling you something useful? There's so many options to choose from. And as a startup, you have, may have limited resources. It's good to hire people who have either historically picked up experience in security, or give someone in your organization some responsibility over certain key subjects for them to reach a certain level on. Even if they're not going to directly affect your product, they are going to be involved in interacting and overseeing third-party experts that you may work with. I think you just have to start with baby steps. And one is you need to build a certain level of not expertise, but education within your own organization. One thing I've recommended, I mainly work with large organizations, but when we have worked with smaller organizations, we've advised them to, whether it's Dropbox or whatever else that they might be using, have a treasure trove of documentation, regulations, quick study guides, certifications that you may have paid for your employees to go through, even if it's foundation level. Build a resource internally that people can refer to, and then you'll realize you pick up quite a lot quite quickly. Not enough necessarily to replace an expert, but enough to hold an expert accountable, which I think is important.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Saif actually that you need to also start creating, teams internally who can actually vet or look at what advisors or your partner companies are giving, but start to think from where is your time more useful. So it's more the concept of outsourcing versus insourcing. So even if you are a manufacturer or a small startup, you start to think that this ecosystem is big, right? Where you have the big companies, they have all the resources, they have the cybersecurity team which they are building, they can pump in billions of dollars just because security is now a very important measure. you and me right now are physically separated. I wish I could be in Finland right now speaking to everybody and meeting you in person, but we are not. So we are communicating digitally, and this is going to increase, right? Automation will come up, AI, ML. So everything is getting more and more digital.
Mhm.
So what happens is you need to focus, you need to have those resources you have, which is IP, clinical, the device, technical. If you focus on it and you work with a trusted partner, because the goal is to make trustworthy devices
Mhm.
for your safety, your security, and your patient safety at the end of the day. So use your time wisely. You can go
Mhm.
Wiki, you can go GitHub, you can
Mhm.
do, but as it said, right, you go to a doctor to get treated, you can do it yourself as well, but the chances of success and life
Mm.
is there. So try to treat it with utmost importance and approach security experts in case you feel you need help.
Yeah, it's just, and the very basic, I think, way could be just to evaluate how many hours you're going to spend on this matter yourself, and how much that's going to cost you. And would you be better off just by paying an expert to help you with this instead of you doing it on your own, I suppose.
Exactly. I mean, one very simple initial exercise that I recommend everyone does sooner rather than later. In fact, I recommend everyone do this as soon as they get off this webinar because it's so exciting. No, I mean, sit down with a piece of paper, just a couple of members of the team, and say, okay, who is using our device? Who is distributing our device? Draw it out on a piece of paper. We sell our device to so-and-so. They provide it to so-and-so, who contracts it to so-and-so. Just plot a line through the risk, just so you can see your ecosystem. How many touch points does our device or the telehealth platform part of our device, and obviously there's software and hardware components, how many stakeholders are actually around and playing and tinkering and
Right.
commercially contracted to the device? Before you even discuss anything technical to do with security, that by itself should be an eye-opener and make you understand, okay, we have a certain level of risk we need to start dealing with, and we need to figure out, do we need third-party expertise to support us? Quite likely, yes, but not always. But that's a really simple exercise you could do on a piece of paper between a small group in a couple of hours.
What are the cases when they don't need an expert, for example?
Well, if you have no connected device, you are manufacturing a syringe or you're manufacturing a sterile gloves, you have no connectivity. Well, for sure, you would need a different set of biomaterial expertise and other stuff. But in most cases, you're catching up on time and you have resources. You are against time. So if you want to get to the market faster, quicker, a better product, a cheaper product, a faster technology, you have to have trade-off. So trade-off is truth in life. So if you were to have everything faster, cheaper, better, well, that does not exist, right? So
Just
you
like
have
that prompt
to,
would say.
yes. So you need to ensure that this is a product which is, or a device or a technology which is patient is at the center. You are enabling healthcare outcomes, right? So start to think from that perspective. Yes, if you have resources, build team, but try and engage with experts as much as possible.
Can I twist your question slightly? It's not a matter of whether you need experts. It's a matter of whether you need them as outsourced or insourced, because you need experts for every part of your business. You want the best people. If you have a solution that has a cloud component, you need someone who knows about cloud deployments and cloud security. You're going to need someone who knows about identity and access management. You're going to need someone who knows about European regulations. If you want to go outside of Europe, US regulations. There are so many areas that are going to affect your business. The real question is, how much of that expertise can I hire in-house and justify the funding of? And how much of it actually I am going to need a third-party resource, whether it's an individual, an advisory firm, or a technology company to support us? Because actually, never shun expertise. You want everyone involved in your organization to be an expert in that thing that you want them to do. So it's maybe a philosophical difference, but I think it's more of an insourcing versus an outsourcing question.
That's a good point. I'd like to remind our audience that they can post questions in the chat as well while we continue our discussion. And well, I have only a few questions left, and after that we will open up to the audience. So the next thing I wanted to ask you was, so we have new products coming up and new trends in the medical device sphere, and especially where we're using the home care. Home care is such a big deal these days. How does it affect the cybersecurity issues that startups need to deal with?
If I wasn't speaking as a clinician, I'd say it's awful and it's terrible for security because you have more and more devices interacting with one another. You have more and more networks, home, professional, multiple organizations linking together. You're suddenly, you have someone's jailbroken iPhone that you're running some kind of medical app on, that a device is dependent on, that's then routed back to a healthcare provider. It can get really messy really quickly. So but that's if I was being purely security focused. Clinically, it's fantastic. It makes clinical care so much more patient-centric and effective. But you have these two worlds clashing in terms of perspective. So I think I'll hand it to Shriekanth to say what the solution is in 140 characters or less, preferably.
Well, Dr. Saif actually covered it, right? So, well, even before you go to the new age, you have the legacy devices, which is again a big issue in healthcare setting. So more and more manufacturers, also the whole industry is trying to get into home health, telehealth. Firstly, to make sure you use digital technologies is faster and the care is delivered quickly. But network, everything is sort of things you need to take care of. So you start off with solving one problem and you see there are so many challenges. So there are different stakeholders here. So startups which are operating in, say, telehealth or home health space, they need to start to think, can I leave the safety or my device, which is vulnerable to so many factors, in that system without enabling security by design myself from the beginning? So what can you do to harden your device to make sure that you are at least able to? So I'm a kickboxer, so I do sparring boxing. So how do you train yourself? How do you train your device to be secure from within? At least it can withstand the future vulnerabilities which come in. We don't know, there's so many of them as we speak. We had an attack today on some other supply chain for vaccine in NHS. It's just developing, it's ever growing. So how can you start to tick off at least the basic, because the basic remains the same. Similarly, like a safety of a device, the security of the device, there are some tenets, there are some principles. If you start embedding that, learning that, and implementing that from an early stage, at least you are like shielded with something before you get into the home healthcare and your patient care is affected. Because if your device is involved in something where the patient safety is affected, well, then you are in trouble. So that's something you need to be mindful of.
And I want to just focus in on what patient safety actually means. I know it sounds odd, but if you were to ask the media, and I do a lot of work with the media, I love the media, but sometimes they it's a bit clickbaity. Patient safety means someone has to die, a pacemaker has to get hacked. And I always remind them, we're not in Hollywood movies here. It can be very simple. If you have a device that's monitoring just someone's heart rate or their blood pressure, and you have hundreds of these devices deployed in a community, and healthcare providers have got used to referencing that data, and they log in online just to check on this latest stats, and suddenly all those devices become unavailable, or there is some kind of vulnerability that means those devices, there's a question about their trustworthiness and they need to be recalled. That creates a huge administrative mess for the healthcare providers. They can't just log in and check the latest stats for certain patients. They have to start organizing to call them back in physically to come into clinic, or they have to organize virtual follow-ups or home visits. And you suddenly end up in this period of a few days until this gets resolved, where suddenly no data is coming in. And at that point, something may or may not happen to someone, but from a clinical and an organizational burden, you are causing a degree of harm and disruption. It doesn't have to be death. Someone doesn't have to end up in hospital, but there is the clinical care is disrupted, and that has a degree of harm with it. And of course, there's organizational disruption as well, and administrative disruption. So I just want to, that's a more realistic outcome when we say clinical harm. It's not, it's not some nation state has tried to hack your pacemaker and assassinate you, because we're again, this isn't Hollywood.
Yeah, that's a hypothetical, whereas what she said is more practical.
Just to add to that, right? People will think like, oh, home healthcare has been around for a long time. Just try to think, what is the objective of a healthcare system, right? You're looking at affordability, you're looking at availability, you're looking at access. So this home care model, right, can help you improve the access, can help you improve the availability of the device. It can also the care, reduce the cost as well. But you should always remember that don't confuse the tool with the solution. This is a tool. So you're using a tool, and the end result is health care, right? It's the patient outcomes which matters. So challenges of security are immense. You have the changing security paradigm. And just to add to this, imagine this, okay? Right now, the acute care is done in hospitals, right? And that's why you have all the network security and other things. How about high acute monitoring and remote diagnosis, say for a critical therapy is done at home? What would that scenario be? So you're talking about home hospital, say in 5 or 10 years. And if your devices are secure in any kind of network, your company or your startup gets that much benefit, and you can scale up faster. So start to think about treatment and therapy. These are not far away, that they might actually be done pretty much remotely. Robotic surgery, a lot of things are coming up in future where treatment might change to more from primary to step down and home therapy. So it's possible.
Regarding the discussion earlier, I have a question about the responsibility. How to delegate the responsibility among actors? What's your responsibility as a startup? What's hospital's responsibility? What's corporates, and then your client's responsibility? How does it affect your operations?
That's a fantastic question, I have to say, because there's this temptation to shirk responsibility, unfortunately. But that it's not that straightforward. In fact, everyone is responsible, but in different ways. The healthcare provider is responsible for the procurement of everything that's going to be administered to their patients, whether it's a hospital or it's a community provider, for example. A distributor of multiple different types of solutions is responsible for the quality of those devices and their safety and their efficacy, and making sure they declare that all the standards are being met if they are the main contractor to a healthcare provider. And then as a startup, if you are, whether you're a direct supplier to a healthcare organization or a patient community, or you work through a middle agency, whether it's a telehealth provider or a distributor, you have a responsibility to maintain a certain level, set of standards and regulations. Now, the challenge here is that regulations are still evolving. I dare say they're not at the level yet of where we want them to be, but they're getting there. So on paper, you only have to match the level of regulations that are applying in the market that you wish to be commercially viable in. But in reality, your end users hold you to a much higher standard. Regulatory is the price of playing commercially in the market. But beyond that, there's a certain expectation of clinical safety and functionality and usability and maintenance and support when it comes to these issues that actually goes beyond what a regulatory standard would suggest. So there isn't a kind of who is responsible. Everyone is responsible, but it's from different angles in a given moment in time.
Yeah. So basically, you just need to be responsible for yourself and not to shirk your duties. Like, this is what I'm doing, so I should make sure that what I'm doing is done properly. So
precisely.
Yeah.
Just one word to add: it's a shared responsibility of the ecosystem.
Right. And then I guess the last question would be the trends in the field, in the startups, which are the I would say startup projects that are emerging that require cybersecurity measures. and what are the trends that in cybersecurity in itself? As you said, Dr. Saif said that previously there used to be just security. Now there are more other reliability or something along these lines. That there are different priorities now in cybersecurity. So yeah, what are the trends and for startups and for the field itself?
I mean, I'd say for startups generally, everyone needs cybersecurity, but the more clinical you are in nature, or the more you support clinical care, whether it's decision making or coordination or alerting, anything of that nature, you need to be paying such strict attention to the security status and resiliency of not just your device, but any software platform that's used to manage your devices, whether that's purely at a technical level, or actually it's the end software that the healthcare providers or the patients are using to make the data that comes from those devices useful. That really is a dicey territory, because if your device fails or your platform fails, it can affect clinical care at scale. So I think there it becomes even more critically important. Whereas if you are something more of a health and fitness wearable, you're not being used in clinical decision making, it becomes more of a data privacy issue. And at that point, that's the bigger concern there, because the failure of that device isn't likely to affect clinical services because it's not being used in that context. So that's one thing. In terms of trends in the cybersecurity space, gosh, there are so many. I think, personally, the big one is just generally IoT security, Internet of Things, Internet of Medical Things. That's really a big area. Vulnerabilities, at the hardware, at the firmware level is a really interesting area. You're getting ransomware is getting more and more sophisticated. The behavior of the attackers. You have fileless malware, which is another completely interesting space. There are so many ways to get into it, and it's you can really geek out on it if you're into it. And I wouldn't worry too much about the trends within cybersecurity. I'd worry more about the trends in terms of what your company does in terms of the products and services it provides and where it sits in the ecosystem of interaction of healthcare. I think that's more important actually to determine your risk and what you should do, rather than getting into the really geeky parts of cybersecurity.
Got it.
Like me, I like that.
I agree with Dr. Saif, actually. Just start to think, right? Trends are emerging. You can see it right now. So the infrastructure in healthcare is changing. You have faster, even with or without COVID, you're going digital, you're going on the cloud, you're going software as a service, the healthcare services, the software, anything which you use for the doctor to diagnose, treat, or prevent is going software centric, right? Like everything else. Second thing is your team and your office, your industry, everybody is working remotely, and even your product development is working remotely. So if you have a software, you have a medical device, everybody is working remotely. So try to think from that perspective that you have to also adapt. And due to this, you have a telehealth solution, remote patient monitoring, all these stuffs which are coming up. Is your startup or is your digital health solving these challenges? And if yes, and most of the time the answer is yes, then cybersecurity is something which is a primer. You need to start looking at it. Don't look at cyber, but start to think from device security and data security. So these two sort of covers a large part of from a device manufacturer or a healthcare provider perspective.
Right. Thank you very much for all the comprehensive responses you've given so far. And I'd like to now open up the discussion to our attendees and participants. You feel free to just post a question in chat or just turn on your mic and ask just personally. Let's see who is going to be our first brave participant to ask the question. Wow, it's this hard, eh? I had a gut feeling that it might be this challenging for people. I guess the reason probably is that it is such a, as I said earlier, obscure in a way field that you don't even know where to start. I guess then better while our audience is coming up with questions, I could ask you, what do you think we've missed in this discussion? What are the topics we didn't tackle and should be tackled?
I mean, one question that I would have, kind of almost me asking the audience, is when I left clinical practice and I set up the Abed Graham Group a decade ago, my real purpose initially was to get more clinical involvement in technology. I thought there weren't enough doctors and nurses having a say in how technology companies develop their products, develop their strategies, and kind of roadmapped what would benefit patients. And then obviously I ended up, by accident in the world of security. One question I'm keen to understand from your startup community: how many have a chief medical officer or a chief nursing officer, or have some level of clinical involvement in the development of their products? Because actually, having a clinical involvement is a really nice way to start talking about security, because you just ask, how many ways could patients be affected harmfully if our device or our platform fails? Or if our platform fails, what could go wrong for our patients or the clinicians using our solution? And then the segue from that is, okay, fine. Technically, how would the attackers cause that failure to happen? So you reverse engineer it, but you start with someone that isn't in a security function. It's someone purely in a clinical function, but you end up with a security plan as a consequence. So that'd be a really neat way to look at your risk profile. So I'd be curious, actually, in your at Turco, what percentage have some clinical representation in their organizations?
Well, it's going to be hard for me to give you a very exact, precise answer, but I would say majority of medical startups, medtech startups, do have a clinician either on their boards, on their team, on their advisory team. Firstly, ironically, for a slightly different reason, for a trust issue. Basically, if you don't have a clinician in your team, just a large group of your team, then it's going to be very hard for you to sell your product to the hospital. I think that is the biggest challenge. And I don't think it's only a Finnish thing. I think it's just an issue with the field that doctors trust doctors. And if there is no one advising the team from the medical society or group, then they're like, oh, I'm not sure about your product. You might not have considered everything or something like this. So that's how they end up acquiring clinical expertise on their teams. And of course, well, that is one reason. Of course, you have to verify your product, validate it. You cannot do it just on your own. It has to be done with an expert. So that is the default reason, of course. So I think because of at least these two reasons, startups do acquire clinicians and medical professionals in their teams. But I think it probably affects more the product development than the security issues. I'm not sure how those medical experts, how much they understand about the cybersecurity aspect of things.
That's the point. They don't need to understand anything about security, because they understand about the purpose of the device and what it does to clinical care. So let's take something really simple. You have a device that's monitoring heart rhythm. Okay, and it's monitoring someone who has atrial fibrillation or some other chronic heart rhythm condition. And your chief medical officer understands the perfect function of the device, knows how to sell the benefits to the medical community. He or she has done everything that you've said, validated the benefits. And then someone turns around and says, okay, we've been using this device and its platform for the last 6 months. We love it. We get really hooked onto it. What happens if one day all these devices stop working for a week? What do we do? What's the backup plan? How are you going to help us out? Do we just have to call all the patients in? Is it game over? What's the plan? You could have one of your technical engineers stand up and give a technical response, or you could have your chief medical officer say, we've thought about that. As part of our clinical risk assessment,
Mhm.
If we find that even one device isn't working, this is what we'll do. 1, 2, 3, we'll coordinate X with you, we'll coordinate Y with you, we'll communicate with the patients like this. It will flag up as an alert and actually in the software system. So you're actually discussing what's a response to a security incident without even mentioning security at all. And maybe even the clinician not even understanding overtly that they're discussing a response to a security incident. That's why if a lot of your, the Turco Hub have access to clinicians, use that resource to validate the risks as well as the benefits.
I'd like to add to that what Dr. Saif said. If you are a startup, yes, that's very important. But start to look at it from in the regulatory term, pre-market to post-market, not just when the device is being made. You start looking at it, but also after the device is in the market, there is a lot of changes which is done to it. How are you managing it? So I'm happy to have a chat with anybody who is looking at key steps, how to get started, like 1, 2, 3 things they should immediately do now. It all starts with risk analysis, security risk analysis, and then you sort of understand, okay, this is what I need, this is extra thing I need. Not everybody needs everything. So start to think from overview in your life cycle, pre, post, total entire life cycle.
Right. Fair enough. We do have already 2 questions actually here. One has been sent to me directly. I'll read that one first. It says, the question reads, where to start? So read the ISO 27001, Google Cybersecurity, weather.com. What are the most relevant white paper providers in cybersecurity? Where to tune in? Basically, what are the Dr. Saif's baby steps to tune into cybersecurity? And Shriekanth.
So I would look at it like this. I would come back to the first step. The first baby step is to understand where you sit in your ecosystem.
Right.
After this session, tomorrow, next week, founders of your company, whatever the setup is in your startup, get a piece of paper and map out every single stakeholder that interacts with your product from the moment it gets sold. Map that out. And then that is your ecosystem of everyone who could be affected by a cyber attack that hits your product or platform, but also could identify third parties that if they get hit by a cyber attack could affect your product or platform. So before you start looking then at the details of NIST and ISO and MDR and everything else, cloud-based regulations as well, first of all, you need to understand your ecosystem, the partners, the end users. Do that first. It should take a few hours. And it's really good. I'm going to leave Shriekanth to mention something else. There are risk assessments that have been developed that cover all of this. I've been very fortunate to have worked with Shriekanth on developing an assessment tool for this as well. But I'm going to leave that for Shriekanth to discuss. But establishing your baseline risk and who you affect and who affects you is step number 1. And then everything else can kind of flourish from there. That's what I would say first. Shriekanth, what do you think?
Well, definitely. I'm just thinking from a regulatory perspective as well, because everybody is looking at meeting the MDR, which is coming in 4 months. So I would say start with few things, which is again the same thing that you're talking about. Try to understand what is the key security design elements for your device posture, because your device can be different types, your connectivity can be different, your clinical outcomes can be different. Start to think from your intended use. All right, start to see, okay, what is that I want to protect, right? In a layman term, simple term, start to do a risk analysis of that. Once you identify this, you have key security design elements you need to protect. Try and see how you are trying to enable it during your development life cycle. Document this, because in a development life cycle, if you know device development, you need to also make sure that whatever steps you're taking, I'm explaining it in a very layman term, whatever steps you're taking, you have documentation to show that the process are taken. This gets into the QMS part. And once you do that, you also make sure you have a post-market management plan, so that it sort of falls into a nice set of documentation as well as security risk management, which you're offering to the future regulators you are submitting this to. So with your device lifecycle, what you do for safety, you have steps in processes for 13485, for one risk management, 14971. Try to segregate the security element in each of this so that as a manufacturer of a particular device, I start to think about it not separately, that security would not come later, but from the beginning, try to club security elements in each phases of your development.
Right. I wonder if we should take an anecdotal example or evidence. Well, just an example. Let's say a software that is helping patients to, I don't know, monitor. I don't know. Can you come up with a very good a good example that could uh, be a very descriptive
I
one
think
for?
there's a question there on the this thing here, chat here. It says, in case of medical information software development, is it enough to trust the security to the developers team first class, or is it worth to get a third party specialized in medical security? All right. So if I were to take this question, I'm assuming this, there are classes of medical information system which falls under non-medical devices. So I'm not getting the question correctly, but assuming this is a medical device, all right, it's a class 2A or class 2, or, a medical device which is low to medium risk. What happens? How do you start?
Yeah.
So it says that, do you trust that security to the developers team? So I'm assuming that you have the software team here and they write very logical code. Everything is there. I'm not saying they embed the code and the password is password, but there is a lot of steps they take. So you start to think, give them resources, give them security tools, give them, access to encryption, authentication, everything which is required. You can read the guidances, we can help as well. So start to think from that perspective. But from a first thing I could say is, do your risk management. If possible, try to do threat modeling, which is like, figuring out which are the threat vectors, how can you mitigate those stuffs. If you can do it in-house and you have expertise, this is again in-house, in-source, outsource thing. If it is possible and you have sufficient bandwidth, try to get it done internally. But like from a regulatory perspective, you need all this documentation. Doesn't matter if it's in-house or outsourced, you need to provide it in a certain format. So that is important. If you can't do it, try to get help from experts, at least request or find out, do some education. You can request, Dr. Saif is a cybersecurity expert. You can attend conferences, meet companies, but as much as possible, try and seek help before it gets too late, before at the end of the journey, end of the development, you are like, okay, now I need to do security. What do I do? It's a little bit too late. So try to start a little early.
And I want to add that secure by design doesn't just mean good coding or good embedding of security components into your product. Because with the best will in the world, I don't care how good a programmer, coder, development team you are, you're going to build a product that's vulnerable. Because every product known to man nearly has kind of been vulnerable, or at some stage being found to be vulnerable. That's why we get things like SolarWinds and federal agencies having issues. So, let's be clear about that. So what you need to do at the design stage is not just design, I suppose, the code. You need to design the incident response practices. You need to design the ongoing risk assessment. You need to design the crisis communications process. You need to design the stakeholder assessment process. There are all these non-technical but critical processes that you need to design for at the design stage. Because actually, the companies that come out looking good from a cyber attack, as good as you can get, are the ones who had a really transparent and clear action plan that they communicated to their customers when the cyber attack happened. It's the ones who completely close up. It seems like they're panicking internally. That's when it goes really, really badly. But if you have a plan, And you go, look, in this business, there is risk. We've minimized it to the extent that we thought we can, but this incident happened. And this is now the response to make sure that the impact is as minimal as possible. Your customers will think higher of you as a consequence.
Of course, of course. Thank you, Christopher, as well for the question. That was a very nice question indeed. So I think, I wonder, do we have any more questions?
Rashad, just
yes.
one quick point, just to bear in mind with the medical device regulations, the whole concept of software as a medical device is a really important thing to be aware of.
Right.
So software can be classified as a medical device.
Yes, of course.
So just, it's something for everyone to be aware of in terms of how they risk assess themselves as
well. Sure, Michael.
Yeah, hi, Mikael from SensorTrend. So one niche question regarding integrations to hospital IT systems. In my experience, each system has a bit of their own rules and their own blankets that you should fill in. And it's not necessarily the clinicians we need to talk to and convince, it's much more the IT people of the hospital systems. So any future movements or news towards harmonized set of requirements from hospital systems, that would be really welcome.
I'm going to let Shriekanth answer in a moment, but just in terms of harmonization of regulations and standards, it depends on what sector you look at. If you look at things like the NIS directive, it's more about looking at healthcare as a national critical infrastructure. There's a certain approach to standards harmonization there. If you're looking at medical device specific standards, again, there's a certain set of harmonization there, and so on and so forth. And that's evolving all around the world, between the FDA, between the EU. There's a lot of developments there. So I wouldn't say that there's one targeted harmonization. It depends a bit more on the perspective that's being taken. So it's still a bit messy. It's still going to take a long time. And I agree. I think you're going to see between healthcare providers, you're going to see variations and fluctuations in their interpretation of security. And unfortunately, that is a little bit of the cost of doing business until you have enough customers where you say, actually, there's 4 flavors of healthcare providers and their tolerance of security and risk. And you end up managing through economies of scale, the cost of managing the 4 different types. I pick 4 just as a random number. That's been my experience with healthcare providers around the world and with harmonization.
I'll just add to that, which is, it depends on what healthcare software it is. Is it a health records, a EMR, a EHR, or is it a PACS or a connectivity software? So I specialized in PACS and radiology information system, picture archiving system. So those have a different interoperability standard again, which is HL7 stuff. But there is also new things which is coming up, which is FHIR. I'm not sure if you heard about it, which is fast healthcare interoperable resources. There is a whole lobby of interoperability experts and standards in the US, primarily. So there is a lot of things as a manufacturer, if you're talking, you need to adhere to simple like DICOM. If you're sharing your picture images, you need to have DICOM. It's version 3 right now, HL7. We can get a little bit more technical, but from a security perspective, you need to make sure that you facilitate interoperability, but if it's part of the ecosystem, you are not responsible for something which is a legacy and getting older and connectivity is not there. So it gets very, very detailed. So I hope if you can write to me, I can share some other things apart from clinical side.
We are really deep in HL7 FHIR and interoperability, and that's fine. And that is specified quite well. But then all the cybersecurity questions on top of that the hospital IT system guys come up with, those are really where the variation is.
Yeah, and let's not forget, I mean, HL7 wasn't designed with security in mind, Version 2 is a nightmare. Version 3 has reverse compatibility issues, even though it's vaguely a bit better, and FHIR is still prone to misconfiguration issues. So it's one of those things that just, it's just a minefield. And I've seen some fantastic research where you look at HL7, you look at encryption being used and involved with that, and you exploit the encryption to get your malware into the system hidden from prying eyes. So there's so much unfortunately, it is very messy, and that's part of the reason why there's such variability, depending on who the CIO is, depending on who the network administrators are. And actually, in the US, a lot of healthcare providers now have chief information security officers, whereas that's still more of an emerging trend in Europe. So if you have a CISO who's really into, obviously responsible just for security, they may create a whole bunch of more complications. Rightly, I say rightly, some may say wrongly. So there's a lot there, unfortunately. It's part of the maturation process of the health systems.
Right. Thank you very much for the answer. And thank you, Mikhail, for the question. I wonder, do we have any more? You can just ask yourself or send it to the chat. But if we don't, Shriekanth, was there any question that you think we missed?
I think there's a question.
Is there?
Yeah, there's a question on budget. Can you give some consideration or share your experience on how to budget cybersecurity aspects during development cycle, and then once commercialization has started? Maybe Dr. Saif, you can start on that. I can probably add on to it.
Budgets are very difficult. Security, at the very least, is a cost of doing business situation now. But at the very best is a competitive differentiator if you have the right way to market it and use it as a part of the clinical impact equation. If you want to look into actual discounted cash flow models, say if we invest X amount in security, we could prevent these types of incidents that on average have a cost of Y and Z. You can do that, and you need more. That's more for your the finance lead in your team to take a look at that. But it's a very difficult area to look at, and this is not the ideal answer, but what you actually need to do is build a portfolio of evidence looking at similar companies, similar attacks in the sector, look at the impact of those, compile it together. And I say this, if you're not the budget holder, if you're the budget holder, everything we should have said today should have convinced you to allocate some budget. But if you're someone who's requesting budget or taking it to investors, then you need to kind of compile a bit of a dossier and a presentation based on trends in the industry that closely resemble your function as a company, and take it from there. There are financial models that can be used to try and calculate it, but at the end of the day, it's still a bit of an art rather than a science.
Yeah, I'll just add on to it that it runs throughout the organization. It's complex, right? So you can sort of create a RACI matrix, right? The responsible, accountable, consulting, informed matrix. Because of the complexity here, you start with the range inside the organization. You start with senior management who wants to be involved of budget, staffing, enablement of everything. It's not just your device cybersecurity, but in fact throughout the product lifecycle, you have to determine what's the right level of security requirement. You need to then figure out the implementation. How do you design? What is the best practice? What is the applicable security technologies for your device? Try to think about it. Do proactive security thinking, how it will enter your market. You had one question on whether it is appropriate regulatory documentation and stuff, and then after you've developed the device, how you maintain it. How do you do security maintenance? How do you do incident response? So probably doing a matrix where you have a sort of you in organizations, you already have this kind of high level matrix. Probably from that, you can sort of figure out, okay, there's so many things to do, and then allocate appropriately for your device security posture.
Yes, indeed, there was a question. Sorry, Rafael, I didn't see it when I scrolled through somehow. And then there's one more asking about blockchain being relevant, having a relevant place in all this.
Startups probably won't like my answer to this question. I would say a lukewarm, probably, but not on the grand scale that people wish it to be. And that's not because the technology isn't beneficial. The immutability aspects, the audit tracing, there's a lot of important stuff there. And when you start looking at supply chains, it gets really, really interesting. I know Estonia have done some fantastic stuff with their kind of national electronic health record. But when you start getting into, with all due respect, very large complex health systems, United Kingdom, France, Germany, the regional subdivisions, I really start to wonder, and I've been interviewed about this before, about who's going to administer it, who's going to maintain it, how much bureaucracy is going to be involved in the setup of it, how will there be interoperability with closed ecosystem IT systems that are already widely deployed in healthcare. There seems to be a huge amount of hurdles, and there's no real company or organization that I see taking the lead to deal with these with respect to blockchain. And really, I think the use cases, they'll be there, they'll be scalable, but they'll be highly specific in my opinion. So I'm not necessarily as excited as maybe some of the trends in the media were. Not so much in the past 6 months to a year, but certainly in 2017 to 2019, I couldn't escape any article about blockchain revolutionizing healthcare.
Yeah, same views, because clinical side of things and technology side of things are two very, very separate domains. Blockchain is very exciting. I hope there will be some development in this in at least next 5 years, but it might happen, you never know. But before the pandemic, telehealth, which has been there for last 30 years, did not get that kind of attention, and now telehealth and digital health has boomed. You look at the funding available for startups, it's all blown away, right? It's gone huge, and that's why we're talking cybersecurity now. It's become a must. So it might happen. There is AI, there is machine learning, many things which goes along the same way. But in healthcare, things go very, very slow. So please be mindful of that.
I always remind people, it took 17.5 years for the stethoscope to get adopted. I always remind people of that point. We're a bit better now, but still.
Thank you as well for the question, and thank you for the answers. Well, 7 minutes to go. About coming back to the question I had earlier, I asked Dr. Saif, but I wonder if Shriekanth has something in mind as well. That, do you think we've missed something basic that early stage teams need to consider about cybersecurity?
I think Dr. Saif covered it pretty well.
Right.
Start to think, why are you talking security? Start to go to the ABCs, right? The first principles, like Elon Musk says, right? What is that you're trying to do? Try to map, there are so many resources, so many tools. You get bogged down with it. I'm talking about startups. I'm not talking about the big companies. There are processes and systems and programs. Everything is in place. With startup, you need to prioritize. So if you can get external help to prioritize and take care of the security for you, well, that would be good. If there are companies like that, try to think, try to network, try to partner, because it's an ecosystem. You need partners, you need people to help you. Even in the hospital delivery, you can't do it alone, right? So try to talk to expert partners, try to get more information, try to be part of health hubs, incubator hubs like Turco. Get that support, because there is support available. Although we all are very separated and physically separate, we all connected virtually. So there is a lot of support available. Seek out for resources, try and talk to right people, and as much as possible, seek out help and do it early.
Right. Fair enough indeed. I'm wondering, so this session has been recorded, and we will, if that's okay with everyone, we will be sharing it with the audience and the slides as well. And is it possible for our audience to approach you after this event via email or something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm you can connect with me on LinkedIn or message me on LinkedIn. Be warned, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so your feed will be filled with my comments and postings. I'm also on Twitter, and I'm sure my email address can be shared through you.
Right, because then I will together with the recording, I will also send the slides, and we will just put one more slide at the end with your contacts, and I think that should do it.
Definitely, LinkedIn is the best way to contact and reach out, or even direct email. And now you can use Signal as well, we have our contact numbers there. So feel free to reach out. There's no limitation. Thank you.
All right, then thank you very much. I highly appreciate both of your participation, your answers, and the passion that you explained all these matters to all of us. I think it's a slightly difficult, challenging subject, and it always helps to have someone who is really passionate about this when they explain it. Thank you very much, and hope we will have another event sometime in the future about this. I think it's a very relevant one. Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you, Rashid. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.